Hang on. Right, okay. Is that okay now? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, everyone can hear you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this first meeting of SAATH. I really feel very privileged to be asked. And the subject is, of course, a very important and very interesting one for all of us. Partition, as many of us know, was the division of India as it was under British rule into two separate countries, India and Pakistan. And during this process of division, this actual partition, a proportion of Muslims who had lived in what was to become independent India fled to Pakistan. And a proportion of Hindus and Sikhs in what was to become Pakistan fled to India. It led to the displacement of 15 people and the deaths of more than 1 million, possibly even 2 million people. The generation which made that dangerous journey have mainly passed on, taking with them their memories of unspeakable violence. But of course, intergenerational violence and trauma lives on and needs healing. But it's equally important for us to be able to understand and analyze what happened, to make sense of it, as it were. And unfortunately, what's been presented to us about that period of history by the BBC, for example, consists almost entirely of that trauma. Many of us would remember the BBC series, which is about the pain and sorrow of people returning to the villages and towns which their families had lived in before partition. Indians going back to what is now Pakistan, and Pakistanis returning to India. In these retellings, what gets lost is the political forces which were behind it and which acted through the years of partition, through the time of partition. And in the words of historian Ravinder Kaur, describing a very similar retelling of partition, which is going on in India, partition is presented, as she says, as a historical wound, curated for display, even dressed up afresh for public consumption. Now, in contrast to this, a decolonial way of looking at partition would be very different. It would look at three main things. It would look firstly at the political forces which led up to partition. It would look at how partition affects South Asia today. And it would also critically examine mainstream accounts, which in this country are often the accounts of British colonial historians. So I will try to do all these things briefly. And whenever possible, I will look at events through the experiences of ordinary people and the various contestations of gender, class, and caste. So to decolonize the history of partition, we have to go back to 1857, which was India's first war of independence, or the mutiny, as it's still called dismissively in British history books. This was a response to 100 years of looting of India by the forces of the East India Company, the first multinational. Colonization, in other words, through a corporation supported by the British government. It was a response to the systematic economic destruction of the economy and the impoverishment of the people. It was also a response to the sheer brutality and racism of British rule, the systematic use of rape as a weapon, for example. The War of Independence was an uprising on an unprecedented scale across what is now northern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, which lasted for over 2 years and required the British to bring colonial troops from other parts of the empire to finally subdue it. And it's interesting, isn't it, that we don't hear about this in our history books. At the heart of the uprising were about 95% of the colonial Indian army, the rebelling sepoys, as they were called, who were mainly Hindus. In addition, there were feudal aristocracy, like, for example, the Rani of Jhansi, you may have heard of. There were a vast number of peasants and unemployed craftspeople whose livelihoods had been destroyed by colonialism. and there were Adivasis, or the indigenous people of India, who were already fighting the British. In other words, there was a very broad demography which had risen up against the British colonizers. But despite this broad demography, as Kalpana Wilson writes in her book, Race, Racism and Development, Interrogating History, Discourse and Practice, the vast majority of British historians, even liberal British historians like William Dalrymple, chose to portray 1857 as a battle between Islam and Christianity. So on the one hand, Dalrymple states that the vast majority of sepoys who were fighting the British were Hindus. And on the other hand, he characterizes the struggle against colonialism as a battle between Christianity and Islam. British historians also fail to acknowledge the brutality of the colonizers, the use of rape as a colonial weapon, for example, before and during the uprising, or even the sheer staggering scale of the uprising. They tend to ignore the work of Indian historians, highly respected Indian scholars like Rajat Kant Roy, for example, who is quoted in Kalpana Wilson's book, who described how the uprising saw people of different religions who shared a syncretic, multifaceted culture consciously unite to fight the colonizers in the name of Hindustani independence. 1857 was also, in a variety of ways, a watershed for British colonial policy. Whereas before 1857, the East India Company had ruled most brutally with the help of the British Army, after 1857, the British state took direct control of India, instituting equally repressive policies. Most important in understanding partition was the fact that from 1857 onwards, because the British feared the unity between Hindus and Muslims, they did everything to undermine and destroy it. And this is a really key point for us today. For example, after 1857, both Hindus and Muslims were systematically encouraged to think that their religion was under threat. At the same time, Muslims were constantly portrayed as invaders and untrustworthy. There was a constant barrage of this type of propaganda in colonial papers, in proclamations, in colonial speeches, and in a constant gradual rewriting of history. Hostility between Hindus and Muslims was actively encouraged, and it culminated in the partition of Bengal along religious lines in 1905. Of course, the British always wanted to partition Bengal. This was a key event in terms of later partition of India, because while Bengal was reunited in 1911, after mass protests and strikes and even assassination attempts, the damage had been done. And sure enough, the very next year, 1912, saw the emergence of two communal organizations. And by communal, I mean against other religions, right? So there was the Muslim League and there was the Hindu Mahasabha. And both of these organizations deliberately distanced themselves from the anti-colonial struggle. While Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League and later the head of Pakistan, is credited with the idea of the partition of India into two separate nations, it was V.R. Savarkar, the ideologue of the Hindu Mahasabha, who had floated the idea of two nations 3 years before Jinnah. The Hindu Mahasabha was interesting because it eventually morphed into the Jansangh Party, which in turn changed its name to the Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, which today forms India's ruling government. And this is why many commentators point out that the BJP is not and never was truly nationalist, in that it never acted in the benefit of the nation. It was, if anything, pro-colonial. The second thing about the Hindu Mahasabha, which is of interest to us, is that many of its leaders were also leaders of the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. The RSS is the fascist organization, which is today the ideological parent of the BJP. Of course, one should never use the word fascist lightly, but it's the only accurate description of the RSS. It was and is an upper caste Hindu supremacist organization modeled on Mussolini's black shirts and based on an admiration of his Hitler. Its leaders saw Hitler's treatment of Jews as a model to be followed in India against Muslims. While the Hindu Mahasabha and Muslim League did all they could to support the British, the struggle against colonialism, of course, continued. After the Quit India movement of 1942, which was a massive uprising all over India, the British knew they had to leave, and quickly. And then the Bombay Naval Mutiny, which was a massive general strike by the Navy in 1946, hastened their departure. The details of British callousness and bungling around the actual division of land between India and Pakistan, which led to such an enormous loss of life, can be compared to the callousness and bungling with which Boris Johnson's government has handled the COVID-19 pandemic. Although if you get your information from the BBC or the British media, you wouldn't know this. Contemporary films like Viceroy's House and recent articles in the British press managed to tiptoe around this aspect of colonial history. Briefly, partition was due to take place in August 1948, but it was brought forward by a year because the British were worried that they were going to be pushed out before that. Rumors of divisions of Punjab and Bengal spread like wildfire. People panicked because they did not know which side of the border their homes would fall. And these rumors were fed, perhaps inadvertently, by the British government. For example, it was public knowledge that the outgoing Viceroy, Wavell, had suggested what was called a rough border before he handed over to Mountbatten in February 1947. When partition was finally officially announced in June 1947, the lawyer responsible for drawing the exact boundaries had no knowledge at all of India. He arrived in India, was given only 5 weeks to complete this incredibly difficult task. And the border was eventually announced incredibly after both countries were independent on the 17th of August. And they were, of course, India became independent on the 15th, Pakistan on the 14th of August. Partition was the largest cross-border mass migration in recorded history. But the British rulers had made no preparations or arrangements of any kind. As historian Stanley Wolpert wrote in his book, Shameful Flight, The Last Years of the British Empire in India, no viceregal time had been wasted in planning for the feeding and housing and medical needs of 10 million refugees. There were very few security measures taken, with the army also divided between the two countries. Partition saw the most gruesome and sadistic violence against women. Women were gang raped, their bodies were mutilated, they were also killed by their own families because patriarchy deemed that to die was better than being dishonored. This happened to Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh women. The experience of Sikh women is explored in the brilliant film Kala Pani, which maybe you should also watch sometime. The scale and cruelty of these events was staggering. If we examine and reflect on these women's narratives about partition, which have been and are still being recorded in India and Pakistan, a number of things become clear. Firstly, that there can be no non-gendered way of understanding that period. These are not just things that happen to occur. They are the lens through which we must see the actual process of partition. Secondly, the narratives told by women demolished the notion that women in South Asian communities were simply symbols of honor and lacking in agency. And thirdly, to fully understand these experiences, we need also to examine colonial as well as South Asian patriarchies. Indian as well as Pakistani researchers have examined women's narratives, and there have been some remarkable books. For example, the writings of Urvashi Bhutalia, Kamla Bhasin, Ritu Menon, and Veena Das. And films like the Pakistani documentary Stories of the Broken Self, quoted by Humaira Saeed in her fascinating thesis, Persisting Partition, Gender, Memory and Trauma in Women's Narratives of Pakistan. It's clear that the trauma of those terrible experiences have haunted the lives of those who experienced it. The memories did not fade, even though they tried to push them aside and live their lives. As Nusrat, a woman living in Pakistan, explains in the film, none of this is written in any of our history books. We have never read about this, never thought about it. Why are we only concerned with ourselves, our own selves? My children tell me, Ammi, forget about it. We want peace, especially my grandchildren. And I say, yes, so do I. Why did this happen? Women's bodies are used as the ultimate weapon of wars everywhere. But those of us who are involved with fighting violence against women are familiar with the echoes of this sadism and misogyny in our South Asian communities in this country. We must remember that South Asian patriarchies have also been profoundly shaped and intensified by colonialism. But that is beyond the scope of this talk. I've just touched on the extent to which partition embodied gender violence. How was caste implicated in partition? I can only touch briefly on this, partly because the research has not been done as to the extent it should be. I'll look at two aspects. Firstly, the actual process of partition. During this, the close proximity between oppressor castes and oppressed castes was in itself an arena of violence. This manifested itself in a variety of ways. The two main themes have emerged. Firstly, the direct violence against Dalits by oppressor castes, and secondly, the way oppressor castes shielded themselves and used oppressed castes to attack Muslims. But experiences are somewhat different in different parts of the country. In Punjab, the Dalits were said to have been targeted somewhat less than oppressor caste Hindus and Muslims, since they were regarded as belonging to neither caste. But it was what happened after partition, in the resettlement of refugees from Pakistan, that really holds up a mirror to the casual but vicious casteism of the Indian establishment. The Dalit refugees from Pakistani Bengal, which is now Bangladesh, of course, who were extremely poor, were sent by the government of India to rocky, inhospitable regions in Odisha. When, after many years of trying unsuccessfully to settle there, they tried to return to Bengal, West Bengal in India, they were asked to move back. And when they refused, they were eventually brutally attacked and killed, many of them. Dalits from Pakistani Punjab were settled, for example, in an urban locality in Delhi called Regarpura, in a part of Delhi which is called Karol Bagh. They were settled separately from other refugees and provided only with tiny mud huts covered with tarpaulin. In other words, the very apparatus of state resettlement programs found no mention in the resettlement policies. Caste found no mention in the resettlement policies. This spatial separation also resulted in the exclusion of Dalits from popular narratives of the trauma and loss. These accounts are nearly absent from accounts of partition migration. The history of partition, its inherent violence, allows us to understand the violence-ridden climate of India today. How else would we make sense of the lynching, murders, and rapes of Muslims and Dalits, which have been happening on such a massive scale since the BJP came to power? We must remember these were the same forces that were largely implicated in the drive for partition. Is it a coincidence that while Savarkar campaigned for an upper caste Hindu supremacist state back in 1923, now almost 100 years later, under the BJP and RSS, we're beginning to see the implementation of this Hindu supremacist state. The purpose of history is surely to understand the present in India. We must remember the words of Golwalkar, the most influential leader and ideologue of the RSS. He wrote in 1939, Muslims should be made to leave the country. If they stay and retain their religion, they must be wholly subordinated to the Hindu nation, claiming nothing, deserving no privileges, not even citizens' rights. This is literally what is happening in India as the Modi government brings in a new citizenship law that disenfranchises India's large Muslim minority. These are the people, these Muslims in India, these are the people who chose to stay in India at partition, refusing to leave their homes because they prefer to live in a secular nation. That secular nation, that secular India is now being transformed, its constitution being abrogated. I will stop now, but I would like to remind you that if you are against fascism, I hope the history of partition will help you to take a stand about what's happening in India today. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Amrit, for that wonderful talk. Very, very, it was very deep and very complex. And there was a lot of things that you covered in such a short amount of time, trying to bring it up to contemporary history. Before I open up for questions, I just got one question that I want to ask you myself, which is this, because there's something interesting that you said, like the struggle against colonialism in 1857, you said was portrayed by, by the empire as a struggle, basically as a struggle against religion, against Islam and Christianity. Do you see parallels happening today? Because when you said that, I automatically thought of Samuel P. Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, where they use culture and religion to kind of whitewash actual political stuff that people might be rebelling against. Do you see similarities today?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very interesting point. I think the whole question of talking about culture, you should really be talking about more concrete material reality. This has been used, for divide and rule from as we can see, and with disastrous results. I mean, this is how the right functions, to distract, to create divisions, So yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good point.
If anyone wants to ask any questions, can you please actually click the raise your hand thing on Zoom so I can see you guys, and basically you'll be able to ask your question. I'll unmute you as well. So if you guys have any questions, just raise your hand, not on the video, on the actual Zoom application, so that I can unmute you and basically ask you questions. But I do know that if there's one person that I actually do want to actually bring in right now, because he does have a lot of things to say, and he told me himself, is Ilyas. Ilyas, I'm going to bring you into the conversation because you did say that, this is something that...
Okay. Amrit, thank you so much. Mizan, thank you so much for putting on this wonderful presentation.
No problem, bro, but if you don't mind keeping it brief and just...
I will, but it's very difficult to keep this subject brief. And I think Amrit's done an amazing job actually summarizing something so complex in a very succinct way. I'm of Pakistani background, born here in the UK, first generation. And I suppose one of the contaminants in my life throughout my whole life, Amrit, has been South Asian nationalism. I was brought up to have an irrational hatred for Bengalis, for Indians, for others. And this was just something part of the conditioning that I was brought up with, this nationalistic, jingoistic kind of sentiment. And it was only when I actually looked into my history and the history of the Indus Valley, and I reclaimed 1857, which is the true spirit of South Asia, which is all groups working together against the common oppressor, that I actually realized I've been told lies all my life, and that Pakistan is a lie. And when I say this as a Pakistani, you can imagine the vilification I get. You see, it's interesting, Amrit, I think you've nailed it absolutely. This was a collusion between Muslim League, elements of the RSS, BJP, antecedents, and the colonial powers to be, to divide and conquer India, to decimate its ability to be what it should be today, which is a global superpower, a secular, pluralistic, democratic, multi-faith, multi-ethnic nation, which is actually a model of civil society on a global level. Now, by decimating India in the way that they did, they actually completely, they created the theocratic, nationalistic kind of elements that we have today. And one of the questions I always ask is this, that can we pull back from this brink? Can we get back to 1857 and the values of 1857? Can we create a Commonwealth of South Asia where we put all this hatred and nationalism aside? And as you said, obviously the RSS was driven by a completely supremacist fascist notion. I think on the Muslim League side, one of the things I always say is that it's not driven by that notion, but rather it's driven by a 1%. So Pakistan was established by an elite of 1% for 1%. And even to this day, Pakistan remains as a nation which is driven by elites rather than truly a democratic, pluralistic nation. So my real question is this, can we pull back? Because if I can become self-aware, why aren't others in South Asia, you know, to create the largest, you could say, economic and social bloc in the whole world of over 1.5 billion people, why can't others pull back from the brink and return back to some kind of union of South Asia? Can we get back to that? That's my big question to you.
Okay. Amrit, can we get back to how we were before?
Shall I answer that?
Please.
Yes, please.
Well, I think, you know, it's so true that this was all about divide and rule and destroying India, which would have been such a major power in the world. No, there's no question about that. I think given the current situation, what we have to do is the progressives in India and Pakistan have to ally, and they have to fight fascism when they see it. And which is why, you know, like I belong to South Asia Solidarity Group, and we have always talked about a unity across South Asia of progressive, democratic, revolutionary forces, you know, people who are against fascism. And that is really extremely important. I think, you know, I don't know if you've heard of the well-known poet Fahmida Riaz, you know. Yeah. She wrote recently, Modi government came to power after it started enacting its terrible policies, that you know, have that, you know, saying that you, my friends, have become Pakistan. You know, you're becoming like us, which really meant that the kind of repression, you know, India was after all a secular country. It still is on paper, you know. Yeah. Although it may not be that for long. And so it's so important that secularism is maintained. It's so important to take on that fascism, because at least that's a beginning, you know. And it was, you know, it was a place where people could go to discuss it. Pakistanis would come there, you know, progressive Pakistanis. Mm-hmm. But now that's not going to be possible anymore. Because, you know, as I said, you know, we have a fascist government. So I think, you know, the thing to do is to come together as progressives and take on these battles one by one. Mm-hmm. And first on the agenda has to be confronting fascism in India. Because at least there was something there before. Not perfect, far from being a perfect democracy, but still, at least on paper, a secular constitution where people had citizenship rights. And now if Muslims are going to be denied even that, you know, then where are we going?
Mm-hmm. if I can just kind of just build on one point as well, Amrit. You see, what in terms of the balance of all of the kind of challenging kind of political elements that we have in South Asia, what's the current situation is that obviously the BJP has actually overcome secular progressive influences, and now secular progressive influences in South Asia become completely marginalized. And then that creates action-reaction on the Pakistani side as well, where they think the only way to respond to it is with, again, a theocratic nationalism. So, you know, one of the things I always say is that if partition had not taken place, what we would have had in South Asia with Bangladesh, with Pakistan, would have been a block of 500 to 600 million South Asian Muslims. And what that would have done would have created much more of a balance on a kind of social and political level within the society that would have allowed actually the, I feel that would have stopped kind of fascistic and extremist kind of nationalistic elements from coming to the fore. But of course, that's all been fractured now, but I don't know what happened, you know, in terms of baby steps. You said progressive alliances against fascism. Absolutely, totally agree with you. But in terms of economic union, can we see more economic union, do you think, in South Asia?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, you can't talk about economics unless, you know, in this situation. Because, you know, there's such a big separation. Pakistan is getting much closer to China, you know, India is following Trump. So, you know, one can't really discuss that. What I think we should know, and I mean, all of us in this meeting who are basically progressives, you know, some of you on the Labour Party, I think what we should realize and understand is that when I talk about fighting fascism, I'm not talking about me, right? I'm talking about a huge movement in India, which has risen up, you know. I mean, just before the lockdown, there was a huge movement against the citizenship laws right across the country. You know, students, Muslim women, you know, all kinds of people. And this is very important for us to understand. So even from the point of solidarity, they are crying out for solidarity. So it's up to us to show it, you know.
Yeah, I totally, sorry, Ilyas, we got a quick question on the chat. I kind of agree, like, in terms of like what you're saying, Amrit, in terms of creating solidarity and coming together with progressives in, you know, in both in India and Pakistan, and obviously our Bengali heritage, so Bangladesh as well. I think what Ilyas is coming from the point is that obviously instead of partition, he's talking from a point of unity, like basically, you know, a united front, which a lot of people agree with. But there's a question that was put up on the chat, and then it's going to be after I ask this question and you answer, Amrit, I'm going to go to Igile, but she's got a hand raised. But the question is, what do you think? What do you think about the role of the Khilafat movement in basically fighting British colonialism in India? You know, the questioner said that they also had a role in creating Pakistan. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think, you know, the Khilafat movement started off very well. I mean, it was certainly a progressive movement of its time. But unfortunately, you know, they got bogged down because, you know, a very large number of people migrated to Afghanistan, you know, thinking that, you know, they would have a base there and so on. But this didn't happen. You know, Afghanistan wasn't able to provide that. And I think this was a major flaw. You know, you can't go out of the country unless you're sure that, you know, the place you're going to is going to give you that support within your country, you know. So I think it was fairly flawed from that point of view. The other thing, of course, was that it was, you know, primarily Muslim. It was not a united movement in any sense. So, you know, from that point of view, I think it had some major weaknesses.
Okay.
Maybe we should take some questions from the chat.
Yeah, so we got Aguile, you got your hand raised. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Amrit. Thank you for it's an amazing talk. I mean, for people like me who just who know very little about the subject, it's enormously informative. Just wanted to ask about the links with the British politics and how we can carry it on. So, for instance, I don't know how much you are involved in Labour politics, but I'm sure you would know that in particular constituencies, for instance, in Harrow, the Harrow East, there was a particular discourse around the subcontinent, discourse around Muslims and Hindus and so on, and it was very difficult. So I understand, like, so for instance, Barry Gardiner, who I would argue is on the, in the spectrum of the Labour Party, he's probably on the left, if you like, but his approach on the Indian politics has been very clear. That I have a majority Hindu constituency, and it's very clear what he congratulated Modi. I mean, he backtracked on it as well, but he congratulated Modi becoming prime minister. And it's just, so how can you, in constituencies like these, for Labour activists, if you like, how would you try and address that issue? And I know that it's probably more of a long-term addressing rather than a kind of general election, 6 weeks of campaigning. But how would you, I mean, I don't know, where are you based are you based in London?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Which constituency are you in? I'm just kind of wondering.
So.
Sorry?
I'm unfortunately in Keir Starmer's constituency.
I feel sorry for you, but anyway, yeah. So I wondered whether, what's your take on the, yeah.
So Amrit, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I'd like to, yeah. I think, there's various aspects to this. Number one, how unprincipled is it that you go for vote banks, You don't stand up for any principles. So, I mean, this is very much what happened to Barry Gardiner, and he was a supporter of Modi from way back when. I remember we protested outside his surgery in 2013. And eventually, because there were so many going to be so many protests against Modi coming in, he actually dropped the idea and Modi was not invited. So that was a bit of a victory for us. But he has always been a completely servile admirer of Modi, right? He's even got Modi's endorsement on one of his election posters, I don't know. I mean, how far he is progressive or he isn't. I mean, how can you be progressive if you support a fascist government? He went and personally provided a check for £1 million to Narendra Modi, and much of that found its way to the RSS. This was just before the Gujarat massacres. So it's very, very depressing. But I think what we have to do is work on a ground level, and that's something perhaps the Labour Party has not done enough of, We need to talk to ordinary people. In certain areas, you find a very high proportion of people who originally came from East Africa. And they tend to be, on the whole, much more pro the BJP. The other thing we must understand about the BJP is that it's got a dual approach, as it were. On the one hand, you have the foot soldiers like the RSS people, the mobs, the gangs who go around killing people and lynching Muslims and Dalits. On the other hand, you have these suave, market-friendly, hedge fund managers and others like that, right? And people like Manoj Ladwa, who managed Modi's, who was his representative, managed his campaigns, and a number of others, And they are trying to copy Israel and set up a global, movement of Hindus whose main job is to support the Indian government. And they actually openly say this, there have been articles written about this in the Asian Voice and other newspapers. So, we have a complex problem here, but the Labour Party has to do two things. Number one, it has to take a principled stand for what it's supposed to believe in theory, right? Number two, it has to talk on a ground level to ordinary people, to young people. I think a lot of younger people would realize that this is really, so reactionary, so wrong, so inhuman, How can you support a party which is involved in murder on a mass scale, right? And I think this, and bring information to them, giving them actual information, concrete information, is so important. And I think doing it in a way which brings Hindus and Muslims together, not in a hostile or confrontational way necessarily. I think it's very difficult when you go down there at election times. I mean, I have also campaigned on behalf of the Labour Party, in Harrow, no less. And so I know that it's really difficult because you can't go there just before the election and start saying, don't vote for so-and-so, don't vote for Bob Blackman, because you haven't done any work with them before, and I think that's been one of the major failures of the Labour Party. So, I mean, that's how I feel. That's what I think we need to do to move forward. But in terms of the group I belong to, South Asian Solidarity Group, we wrote a open letter to Keir Starmer. He hasn't bothered to reply to us, pointing out that the Hindu Forum and the people he is so friendly with now are not actually representative of the entire diaspora. They claim to represent Indians. There are many, many Indian Muslims in this country, many Indian Sikhs, and many Hindus who do not support the BJP. So what about all of us? I mean, I'm not religious, but I'm, nominally a Hindu. So I don't support the BJP. You don't have to support them if you're a Hindu. Why would you?
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for that. So the next question will come from Alia Sheikh. Alia, I know I can see your hand raised. So do you want to unmute yourself and basically ask your question? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I could refer you to books about women, women's experiences. I mean, as I said, there's a number of very wonderful books. And do also check out, particularly for women in Pakistan, do check out Humaira Saeed's thesis, which is online. And that gives you a lot of references to the film I mentioned and the kind of testimonies. So I think that's very important for background. I mean, in terms of actually dealing with intergenerational trauma, I think, I think that's probably the methods you use. Well, I'm sure you are more aware of them than I am, but I'm sure they're no different from any other intergenerational trauma that you'd use to deal with that. But there is actually quite a lot of research on gender which is accessible. So do email me if you need that material. I mean, I'm sure Mizan can pass on my email.
Okay, yeah, that would be good. It'd be better to have a more in-depth conversation.
Yeah, that would be cool. And also, one of the things is that I've got everyone's email addresses. So like, I will, with Amrit's permission, she will send me some links and stuff, and I will email that out to people so that people can do their own reading and stuff afterwards. Just quickly, so we've got quite a few hands raised now. Okay, so Vanessa O'Driscoll, do you want to quickly unmute yourself and quickly ask your question?
Yeah, thanks for that, Amrit. It was really great. I was just wanting to ask quickly, kind of leading on from what you said about Labour members kind of needing to have conversations, or just people on the left needing to have conversations with members of those communities, like the Hindu community, for example, and those who may support the BJP. How do we kind of go about doing that in a way that doesn't look like we're just trying to kind of score political points, as it were? Like, do you have any suggestions? Like, I think, because I think most people on the left do have a genuine desire to obviously overcome those kind of divide and rule tactics. But I suppose, like, obviously people like Bob Blackman, for example, have kind of played up to it for their own political gain. And I think obviously we'd be doing it, yeah, with like a longer term goal of actually wanting to connect with those individuals, and maybe from that they would end up voting Labour. I don't know. So yeah, I don't know if you've got any examples, for example, where you've seen this done effectively, like maybe through your work with South Asian Solidarity Group, and yeah, just sort of ways that we could begin doing this, like at a grassroots level, basically.
Thank you. So actual examples and just ways of actually coming across as like, or in a way, authentic, and in having those discussions with people that we profoundly might have political disagreements with. So Amrit, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think, it's really important to have these discussions and to continue to have them and actually argue about things. I mean, if you don't agree, then, let's talk about it. And I think that's the only way we can convince people. It's not, it's not by just not talking about it. So I think that would be really good and really, really important as well.
Do you have any examples of engagement with members of this community that have been won over?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, one thing I would like to say though is that it's not very easy for many South Asians, particularly in areas where the support for the BJP is strong. I mean, I do know of people in Leicester who have changed their minds, but I also know that they find it very difficult to be open about it because of the way in which they're attacked, in the community. So, we need to create a situation where people actually feel they're welcomed, feel they're able to engage without fear, without being intimidated.
Okay, cool.
I think maybe I didn't get the full question. Did you want examples of people who've changed their minds, or? Yeah,
or actual examples. I think that's something Vanessa asked for.
Yeah, I guess I do. I just mean like any examples of like wins in the sense, even on a very small scale, where that has been achieved, where like people have changed their minds in that community, and like sort of just how in like a rough way that was done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there are a lot of people who have changed their minds. I mean, through especially younger people. I mean, there's no question that they have. But as I said, if there are people who are solidly based within the community, and particularly if they can't operate outside of that, then it's also very difficult for them, which we shouldn't underestimate.
Okay, thank you. So the next person is going to be Nirmala. Nirmala, can you please make this quick, because we've got a lot of questions to ask, but people that want to ask questions, but do you want to unmute yourself and quickly ask a question?
Can I just suggest that we take 2 or 3 in one go?
Okay, we could do 2 or 3 in one go then. Nirmala, do you want to quickly ask a question?
Yeah, I mean, Amrit, I just want to ask you a question about, the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha. They were not big mass movements during the independence struggle, and they were not involved in the independence struggle at all. So what impact did they have? Because what I'm thinking is that the Congress itself also had a very messy approach to this whole problem. I mean, clearly they had the big mass mandate. And there was a kind of a soft Hindutva thing that was not Hindutva as such then, a kind of, nationalism that also kind of was laced through with the whole thing, and they couldn't see through it. And of course, the Muslim League was the same, I suppose, and so they couldn't resolve it. And maybe you could say, I mean, I just wanted to know that how much did the colonial government really sort of tighten the screw on these two people to make this impossible thing that they had to, that the deadlock couldn't be broken, and then they had to go for partition. That's my one question. Very quick comment to the first person who asked the question, the first question about Pakistan and India talking together to bring about some kind of understanding. And Amrit talked about the progressives in India and progressives in Pakistan getting together. I think the linchpin issue is Kashmir, and the progressives in India, I have seen, I am myself from Sri Lanka, and the Indian army was there during our 30 year, they briefly came and intervened in our guerrilla struggles, and it was a disaster. And the thing I want to say is that in India over the years, the progressive opinion has really, I think, coming together to support Kashmiri self-determination. And we have to, as a region, work hard on it on the Pakistani side. I don't see that happening. And that Kashmir is for Kashmiris, and there should be Kashmiri self-determination, and that applies to both India and Pakistan. Now, okay. I don't see that happening, and that is one big, because it is such a pivotal issue for future talks between Kashmiri and Pakistani, Indian and Pakistani progressives to speak about, to discuss.
Okay, sorry, Nirmala, we got people wanting to ask questions. So the next person I'm going to ask is Nadia Yaqub. Do you want to quickly ask your question? Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello, yeah, hi. Thanks anyway, Amrit as well, and yourself, Mizan, for facilitating. My question is a basic one. Obviously, it's a great group you've got, SAATH. Would you be willing to set something up in Barnet, which is where I live, because it's a very Tory area. It'd be good to sort of get a Labour in Chipping Barnet and in Finchley and Golders Green constituencies. So,
right. Okay.
Yeah.
That's.
Shall I just answer those two now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, please. Go on.
Okay. Firstly, Nadia, I think that's such a wonderful thing to say, and I think we should definitely encourage anything like this in Barnet. It's really important. I mean, the way in which it's being seen as though Indians are all like pro BJP, and forget about all the Indians who are not. And I'm sure that there's a role for a socialist South Asian organization in Barnet. So maybe we should try and help you to set that up. The questions from Nirmala, the couple of points. One thing which I think we should emphasize is that during partition, or in the early days, even before partition, the Hindu Mahasabha was a comparatively small organization. It was not very popular really, but it existed. And when the RSS, same for the RSS, but the RSS really got going after the BJP got going. It was always there. It always lurked. It always created. For example, it set up branches in East Africa. In Nairobi, in Kenya. It influenced the people who were coming here. And then it came to Britain and it set up branches here. It was influencing the East African Asian community from way back when, But in India, they didn't have any major base, That all happened after the BJP became a party and became popular, and they did this by whipping up anti-Muslim feeling. And of course, Nirmala, you're absolutely right that there was always a sort of undertow of anti-Muslim casteist feeling with the Congress. I mean, the Congress party, which is the other major party in India other than the BJP, which ruled India for most of India's years of independence. The Congress is, in many ways, its role has been similar to that of the Labour Party, in the sense that the right wing of the Labour Party always projected, policies which were essentially racist. They were the ones who brought the 1971 Immigration Act, which brought in patriality as a clause, for example. They brought in a lot of reactionary policies, which the Tories were able to build on. And that's more or less, we can think of the Congress Party in that way, that they were always, communal. I don't know if any of you has been watching the film of A Suitable Boy. I don't know if people watched it, but
Yeah.
There was a very interesting bit of it where a Muslim man says that, he had stayed on in India. This was in 1952. That scene was in 1952. And we see a temple being built right next to a mosque, intimidation, in other words. And that happened in 1952 under Congress rule. So, we have to remember that the Congress also played a role. And more recently, it opened the doors to the Babri Masjid, which was a 500-year-old mosque, which the BJP, which the thugs of the BJP eventually destroyed, pulled it down. And, not only the thugs of the BJP, the leaders of the BJP were there, ordering the demolition of this building and claiming that this was the birthplace of the god Ram, which is obviously complete nonsense. But, and now, talking about Kashmir, well, Kashmir was always a point of, right from the beginning. The first India-Pakistan war was fought, just after independence over the issue of Kashmir. So yes, Kashmir is a major issue, and I think that SAATH should have a meeting on Kashmir at some point to discuss it in more detail.
We definitely will. Thank you so much. We got one more question from Pamela Fitzpatrick. Pamela, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Really interesting talk, so thank you very much. I was the parliamentary candidate in Harrow East in 2019, and I just kind of wanted to say that we didn't just turn up 6 weeks before. We were actually working there from March 2018 with exactly that tactic, that if we kind of immersed ourselves in the community and worked with people, that we may have a chance. And also I work at the local law centre, so when we were going around knocking on doors, actually kind of poorer people connected, and we did manage to convince people. So probably about 2 weeks before the general election, the data that we had showed that we might just do it, we might just win, or it's certainly very close. But in the last 2 weeks, there was, you probably know this already, there was a concerted effort, a media campaign on WhatsApp, and actual films were being circulated with Jeremy saying really terrible things, and people believed that. But the reason they believed it in some part was because we have a lot of councillors in Harrow who were reinforcing that message. So when they asked that councillors who they knew, or other elected officials, it would be reinforced on the doorstep. And some of those councillors actually said that they would not vote Labour, given the stance at the time. So it's really hard, because even if you do all of that work, and I've invested 2 years of my life in that, and you think that you've really got it, just something, it can change it when kind of people look up to supposed leaders in the community that tell them otherwise and reinforce those messages. And people get anxious, they get worried about the unknown. So it's a real battle that we've got, actually, something that we've got to deal with. And I don't think any of us have the answers, because the kind of onslaught from the media, the combined thing from the Tories, but also some even from our own party reinforcing that message, it's a real uphill battle that I don't know, what we're going to do about it. So I don't know if you have any answers or suggestions, but it's kind of got to be even more than just working in the community with people. But I don't have the answer. But
yeah, that's very interesting, because Amrit,
that's a really important point that you're making, Pamela. And I think, I feel, we in South Asian Solidarity Group feel that we can learn from the experience of what happened around the issue of anti-Semitism. Now, the left never took it head on. They were always apologizing. And this was a completely wrong tactic. And I can well see the same thing happening in the context of Hindus. Because already they're claiming this thing called Hindu phobia, which is, it has no material reality, unlike anti-Semitism, And I can see that any criticism of India is going to be labeled as anti-Hindu, as, therefore, racist, which is really, really, truly, I mean, it's happening already, to be honest, So I think this was a big mistake on the part of the Labour Party. And I don't think that mistake should be now repeated in the context of Modi and the Indian government. I think it's really important to take a stand. Whether you win or lose, at least you would have been principled. This way, Labour has lost anyway. And I think one of the main reasons for the defeat of Labour was that it didn't. There was always seen it on the back foot, always apologizing. And I think I do feel this very strongly, and I feel also disappointed that even the Labour left has not taken a really strong stand. I mean, some people in the Labour Party have, but certainly not as many as one would hope for.
I think, if I could just say one more thing.
I think we will apply to do a fringe meeting. I don't know whether we'll be able to get a chance to do that. Last year we were not. Yeah.
I think one of the things Pamela was trying to say was, how do you counter the lobbying? I know you've written a lot about the lobbying of the pro-BJP groups in the UK, especially in Harrow East. What advice would you give to try and counter the messages and the lobbying that these groups are kind of engaged in?
Yeah, do you want me to answer that now, or do you want to take another question as well?
Yeah, I think people are quiet now, so I think that will be the last.
Well, I think, I think that countering the lobby is really important, and I don't think it's been done, to be honest. I mean, I don't see the left lobbying against the BJP government. I don't see that at all. I think there's so much fear and worry and concern that, this would be seen as anti-Hindu or it might lose votes. I don't see that lobbying happening. So yes, I think lobbying is very, very important and it must be done.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, if there's, I think that will be the final round of questions. So thank you very much, guys, for coming. I hope you guys found it educational and informative. Actually, hold on, there's one more. Nadia, did you want to ask another question? Or did you just
quickly. I mean, going on in terms of what Amrit just said about Labour apologising and capitulating, I think, a hell of a lot to the Zionist lobby. It just seems, how do we stop this happening? I know Amrit said in terms of lobbying, but how do we stop this happening in terms of Kashmir? Yeah, because I don't like this this apologist attitude, because then there's other communities, speaking as a Muslim, and it doesn't just affect the people over in Palestine or in Kashmir, but it affects the Muslim community in the UK as well. And I think Labour and other parties need to be mindful of that. So how do we sort of overcome that or try to deal with that? I mean, I volunteer for 2 Muslim NGOs, MEND and MPAC UK, and Islamophobia has risen. And that is, and a lot of it is to do with what's happening abroad.
Right. Okay, I think that will be the final.
Quickly say something about this.
Yeah, that will be the final question.
Yeah, no, I think, the whole Kashmir lobby is central to this discussion. It must be, the question of Kashmir must be raised. We must question why they changed their mind. And we have to lobby outside of the Labour Party if need be. Now, in that context, I just wanted to also inform people, and I think hopefully Mizan will send this information out in the email. On the 4th of September, we're having, South Asia Solidarity Group is having a webinar to launch a report from Kashmir, from the Kashmir Reading Room, which is a progressive left-leaning organization in Kashmir, about the last year during which Kashmir was annexed by the Indian government. So it should be really interesting. I hope you can join us, but we'll send out all the details.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
And what I'll do is I've got everyone's emails, so I will email the links and all that kind of stuff out as well. I think that will be the final question. Thank you so much for attending, guys. It's been very informative. What I'll do is, this meeting has been recorded. It's been recorded, so I will basically put this up on YouTube and send out the links and stuff like that. So on behalf of South Asians Allies Together Harrow, thank you very much for coming. Amrit, what I'm going to do is give you 1 minute just to give you, if you want to say any final comments or anything, and just basically, yeah, do you have anything final to say just to close off with?
Yeah, I would like to say something.
Okay, yeah, the minute's yours.
Firstly, thank you very, very much for coming to this meeting. It's really great to see so much interest in this subject. I hope that you can carry this forward. I hope that, you know, if there's any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch. Please do follow South Asia Solidarity Group as well on Twitter. We'll send out the details. Join our meetings, particularly the one which is coming up on the 4th. And take a stand. I mean, and try and push in Labour for them to take a stand on this issue, because, you know, we as progressives have nothing to lose, really. We have to fight back on these issues if we believe in fighting fascism.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So on behalf of SAATH, please, thank you very much for coming, guys. Please check us out on YouTube. That's SAATH Together. We are on Facebook. We are on Twitter as well. And what I will do is, I've got everyone's email addresses, so I will email out links and stuff like that. I know, Amrit, we've spoken about reading lists and all that kind of stuff. So we will I will email out the links and all those kind of things as well. Amrit, thank you so much for coming to on this event and taking part in this discussion. It's been a very thought-provoking discussion and a well-needed discussion, and we will build on that. We will have a lot more webinars on these issues, particularly on the issues facing the South Asian community in the UK and stuff like that as well. So we've got those kind of webinars being set up. Just also, I forgot to mention Amrit. Like, Amrit is also an advisor to SAATH as well. So she's someone that I regularly turn to advice and stuff like that. She's got a wealth of experience and knowledge, which I value very much. So we are working together as well. So thank you so much, guys. I hope you had a good evening, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.